I want you to picture something for me before I tell you what happened. Picture a 9-year-old girl standing on her tiptoes at her grandfather's recliner, her mouth so close to his ear that her breath moved the little gray hairs there, and picture her whispering 4 words that would save his life. Grandpa, play dead, not watch out, not run. Play dead. That's the phrase my granddaughter Sophie used, and I will carry the sound of her voice saying it for as long as I live, because seconds later my own son walked into my living room holding a syringe, and he was smiling like a man about to do something kind. Welcome back to Honorline. If you're new here, we tell true stories about family, betrayal, and the quiet kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Get comfortable because this one is going to take a while, and I promise you it earns every minute. Hit subscribe before we start, because there is more where this came from, and stories like mine deserve an audience that remembers them. My name is Walter Doyle. I'm 63 years old, and for 38 years I ran a small contracting company outside Columbus, Ohio, building additions, finishing basements, framing houses for families who were just starting out the way my wife Eleanor and I once did. I sold the business 4 years ago to a younger man named Griffin who used to be my apprentice, and the sale, combined with a lifetime of careful saving, left Eleanor and me comfortable, not wealthy, comfortable, enough to keep the house paid off, enough to take Eleanor to see the ocean twice a year, enough that our son Marcus started looking at us the way a man looks at an inheritance he hasn't received yet. I need to tell you about Marcus honestly, because a story like this only works if I'm fair to everyone in it, including the people who don't deserve fairness. Marcus is 39. He was a sweet kid once, I promise you that. He used to sit on the tailgate of my truck and hand me nails while I worked, proud as anything to be useful. Somewhere between then and now, something in him went sour, and I've spent more nights than I'd like to admit, trying to figure out where the turn happened. Maybe it was when his restaurant failed 6 years ago, and he lost most of what he'd invested. Maybe it was watching his sister, Diane, build a steady, comfortable life in Denver as a hospital administrator while his own ventures kept collapsing. Maybe it was his wife, Renee, who has a way of talking about money like it's oxygen, like the room will run out of it if someone doesn't grab their share first. Whatever the reason, by the time this story starts, Marcus had a look he'd get sometimes when he visited us, a look like he was doing math behind his eyes. Eleanor noticed it before I did. She always notices things before I do. That's 41 years of marriage for you. 6 months before the night Sophie whispered those 4 words into my ear, Marcus and Renee came to Sunday dinner and brought a folder with them, not unusual on its own. Marcus liked to talk about investments, about protecting the family's future, about things that sounded responsible on the surface. But this folder was different. This folder had a name on the cover I didn't recognize. Sorensen and Kessler, Elder Law Associates. We just think it's smart to have things in order, Renee said, sliding the folder toward me across my own dinner table like she was doing me a favor. You're not getting any younger, Walter. Neither is Eleanor. God forbid something happens. Nothing's happening, I told her. I had my physical in the spring. Doctor says my heart's stronger than men half my age. It's not about now, Marcus said, and he had this earnest, practiced softness in his voice that I'd start recognizing as a warning sign later, though at the time it just sounded like my son being thoughtful. It's about being prepared. You built all this with your hands, Dad. Don't you want to make sure it's protected the right way? I want to be fair here because it would be easy to make this into a simple story where every word out of my son's mouth was a lie. It wasn't that simple. Eleanor and I already had an estate plan put together years earlier with our own attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Whitfield who has known our family since Diane was in braces. Everything was already handled, already fair, already split evenly between Marcus and Diane, with Eleanor and I fully in control of every decision for as long as we were alive and capable. Marcus knew this. He'd been told this more than once, which is exactly what made the folder on my table so strange. Why would a man need a new plan for something that was already planned? We'll think about it, I said, which is the same thing I imagine every parent says right before they wish they'd said something sharper. There's no rush. Renee said too sweetly. The way people say there's no rush, right before they start applying pressure. We just think it'd be good for you to meet with Mr. Sorensen sometime soon. Casual. Low-key. Just to talk through some options. I let it go. That's the part of this story I still have to sit with. The part where I let a folder full of warning signs sit on my table and told myself my son wouldn't do anything to hurt me. Some part of a father never stops believing that, even when the evidence starts piling up, even when it should know better. Over the following months, the visits from Marcus and Renee grew more frequent, and every single time, the conversation found its way back to the same handful of topics. My health, my memory. Whether I'd been seeming a little foggy lately. I hadn't been. I want that on the record before we go any further. I have never once forgotten my grandchildren's birthdays. Never once lost my keys for longer than any 63-year-old man has a right to. Never once shown a single symptom of anything beyond being a man in his 60s who occasionally can't remember where he set down his reading glasses. But Marcus started narrating a version of me that didn't match the man I actually was, and he started doing it in front of other people. Softly, casually, the way you'd mention a fact everyone already agreed on. Dad's had a rough time with names lately. He told my brother at a cookout in June, right in front of me, like I wasn't standing 3 feet away holding a plate of ribs. I said your daughter-in-law's name wrong once. I told him afterward, quiet so it wouldn't turn into a scene. I called Renee Renata. That's not a memory problem, Marcus. That's a joke I made because her sister's name is Renata and it slipped out. I know, Dad, he said, holding both hands up like I was the one being unreasonable. I'm just saying it out loud so people understand if you ever need help, that's all. There's no shame in it. There it was again. That soft, reasonable voice building a case. One small brick at a time, in front of an audience that would remember it later as simply true. I didn't understand yet what he was building toward. I thought he was being overprotective, maybe a little insulting, but nothing dangerous. That's the thing about a slow trap. It doesn't feel like danger while it's being built. It feels like mild annoyance. It feels like something you'll deal with, eventually, once you find the energy to have an uncomfortable conversation with your own son. Eleanor felt it faster than I did, the way she always does. In August, lying in bed one night, she said something to me I haven't forgotten. Walter, I don't think Marcus is worried about your memory. I think he's building a record. A record for what? I don't know yet, she said. But I don't like the shape of it. She was right, of course. She's always right. And I've learned that the smartest thing a husband can do is shut up and trust that particular instinct in his wife, because 41 years of marriage has taught me she can read a room, and a person, faster and more accurately than I ever will. The record Eleanor sensed being built came into full ugly focus on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, 3 weeks before my birthday, when our 9-year-old granddaughter Sophie came to stay with us for a few days, while Marcus and Renee attended what they called a financial planning retreat out of town. Sophie is Diane's daughter, not Marcus and Renee's. My daughter Diane has a beautiful, brilliant 9-year-old and lives 4 states away in Denver, which means visits from her are precious and rare. Sophie was only in Ohio that week because Diane had a work conference in Columbus and dropped her off with us for 2 days while she handled meetings, and it was during those 2 days, completely by accident, that Sophie overheard something in a grocery store parking lot that changed everything. She'd gone with Eleanor to pick up ice cream, the kind of small, errand grandparents love finding excuses for, and while Eleanor was inside paying, Sophie sat in the car with the window cracked and watched Marcus's car pull into the lot 2 rows over. Marcus and Renee didn't see her. They were arguing the kind of low, tense argument people have when they think no one's listening, and Sophie, being 9, being curious, being the kind of sharp, watchful child who notices everything adults assume children are too young to understand, heard every word. She didn't tell us that day. She's a smart kid, sharper than her years, and something about what she heard scared her enough that she needed time to work out what to do with it. It wasn't until 2 nights later, at my own birthday dinner, with the cake half cut and the candles still smoking on the counter, that Sophie tugged on my sleeve in the middle of my own party and asked if she could talk to me alone. I want you to sit with that image for a second, the way I've had to sit with it 100 times since. A 9-year-old girl pulling a grown man aside at his own birthday celebration, her small hand gripping my sleeve with a seriousness that didn't belong on a face that young. "Grandpa," she said, once we were alone in the hallway, her voice dropped down to almost nothing. "I need to tell you something and you have to believe me, okay? I'm not making it up." "I always believe you, sweetheart," I told her, crouching down so we were eye to eye. "What's going on?" "I heard Uncle Marcus and Aunt Renee in the parking lot at the store," she said. "They didn't know I was in the car. They were talking about you. Aunt Renee said the doctor thing worked, that you were on the list now. And Uncle Marcus said the shot would make it easier, that nobody would ask questions if you seemed confused after, because that's what shots do to people your age sometimes." I felt something go very still and very cold inside my chest. The same way you feel when you're up on a ladder and it shifts half an inch beneath you, that split second before you understand exactly how much trouble you're in. "What shot, Sophie?" "I don't know exactly," she said. And her eyes were filling up now, the bravado of delivering the message finally cracking into the fear of a child who understood, on some instinctive level, that she was carrying something too heavy for her age. Aunt Renee said something about a nurse friend and getting the paperwork ready first, and Uncle Marcus said once you were, she searched for the word she'd heard, disoriented. The lawyer could get you to sign, and nobody would be able to prove you didn't understand what you were doing. He said your birthday party would be a good time, because everyone would think it was just you having a bad night. Every word she said landed like on another nail driven into the same board, building something I didn't want to see the shape of but couldn't stop watching take form. I need you to understand something about how I felt in that moment, because I've turned it over so many times since. It wasn't just fear, it was a specific, particular kind of grief, the grief of realizing your own son has stopped seeing you as his father and started seeing you as an obstacle standing between him and something he wants. "Sophie," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "did you hear anything about tonight? About what they're planning to do tonight?" She nodded, and her next words are ones I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. "Aunt Renee said the shot has to happen at the party, when everyone's distracted, so it looks normal. She said you probably wouldn't even feel it happen." Sophie's small hand found mine and gripped it hard. "Grandpa? I think Uncle Marcus is going to try to give you a shot tonight. I don't know what's in it. But it's not a real medicine, Grandpa. I heard them say a real doctor didn't give it to them. Aunt Renee's friend from her old job did, the one who got in trouble before. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that hallway, standing beside my birthday cake, with frosting still on my hands, because I think it matters for you to understand exactly how a person processes information like that in real time. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely I had misunderstood. Surely a 9-year-old had gotten details tangled the way children sometimes do. Surely my son, whatever his flaws, whatever cold calculation had crept into his voice over the last 6 months, was not standing somewhere in my house at that very moment, with an actual needle intended for my actual arm. But then I thought about the folder 6 months earlier. The narrative Marcus had been quietly building about my memory, in front of witnesses, brick by careful brick. The way he'd started saying just to be safe so many times it had become a kind of verbal tick. And I thought about the fact that my granddaughter, a child who had never once lied to me in her 9 years on this earth, was standing in front of me with tears building in her eyes, having risked the anger of her own parents to warn me, because some instinct in her, some deep and correct instinct, had told her that what she'd overheard was not a misunderstanding. "Okay," I said, and I made myself sound calmer than I felt, because the last thing that child needed was to watch an adult fall apart in front of her. "You did exactly the right thing telling me. I need you to be very brave for a little while longer, okay? I need you to go back to the party and act completely normal. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "One more thing," I said, And this is the part of the story I still think about more than any other, because what my granddaughter said to me next is, I believe, the single reason I am alive to tell you this story at all. If your Uncle Marcus does come near me tonight with anything, a shot, a needle, anything like that, I want you to remember something. I want you to remember what I'm about to teach you, and I want you to trust me completely, even if it looks scary. Can you do that? I trust you, Grandpa. I told her what I needed her to know. And then, because she is 9 years old and braver than most adults I've met in my 63 years on this earth, she looked up at me with a seriousness that belonged on someone 3 times her age and said the 4 words that would end up saving my life. Grandpa, play dead. Eleanor found me in the hallway less than a minute. After Sophie slipped back toward the living room, her small shoulders squared like a soldier walking back into formation. One look at my face and my wife knew something had shifted in the house, the way she always knows, the way 41 years of reading a man's expressions teaches a woman to read weather before it arrives. Walter, she said, low, urgent. What happened? I pulled her into the laundry room, the only place in the house with a door that actually latched, and I told her everything Sophie had told me. I watched my wife's face do something I will never forget as long as I live. It went through disbelief, then horror, then a flash of pure white fury, and then, in the space of maybe 4 seconds, it settled into something colder and more useful than any of those. Eleanor has always been the strategist in this marriage. I build things, she plans the war. I've learned across 4 decades that when that particular calm settles over her face, the smartest thing I can do is stop talking and start listening. They're going to do it tonight, she said. Not a question. That's what Sophie heard. With what? Did she say what's in it? Not real medicine, I told her. Something a friend of Renee's supplied. Somebody who, and I'm quoting a 9-year-old here, got in trouble before. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was something in them I hadn't seen since 1996, the year she'd gone toe-to-toe with our mortgage bank and walked out having negotiated away a $400 fee through nothing but pure, controlled will. Okay, she said, here's what we're not going to do. We are not going to march out there and accuse our son of trying to drug his own father in front of 40 guests and our granddaughter. If we're wrong about any piece of this, we destroy this family over a misunderstanding, and if we're right, her jaw tightened. If we're right, Walter, we need proof. Real proof. Not a 9-year-old second-hand account of a parking lot argument. Something that will hold up. So what do? We let them think it's working, she said. I want to walk you through exactly what happened over the next 90 minutes, because the plan Eleanor built on the spot. Standing in a laundry room with a birthday cake going stale in the next room is the single smartest thing I have ever watched another human being construct under pressure. It had 3 parts, and every part mattered. The first thing Eleanor did was pull our daughter Diane aside. Diane had come to the party for the first 2 hours before needing to step out for a work call, and she was just returning when Eleanor caught her by the coat rack near the front door. I watched from a distance as I saw my daughter's face shift from casual party smile to something sharpened and focused within seconds of Eleanor starting to speak. Diane has always had this quality, calm under pressure, decisive when it matters, that I think comes from years of running hospital floors during actual emergencies. She didn't waste time asking unnecessary questions. She pulled out her phone, and I watched her thumb move to the camera app before Eleanor had even finished the sentence. I'll stay close, Diane told her mother. I'll keep it in my pocket, recording. If Marcus so much as looks at Dad wrong, I'll have it. The second thing Eleanor did was find Sophie's mother would have wanted her, handled with extreme gentleness, and so it was Eleanor, not me, who knelt down beside our granddaughter in the hallway and asked her, softly, if she felt safe enough to keep playing her part for just a little while longer. You don't have to do anything else, sweetheart, Eleanor told her. You already did the bravest thing anyone did tonight. But if you're okay with it, I need you to stay close to Grandpa for the rest of the party. Not because you have to protect him, because if your Uncle Marcus sees you near him, it might make your uncle more careful, and careful is what we want right now. Sophie nodded. Solemn, as a small judge delivering a verdict, and slipped her hand back into mine the moment Eleanor finished speaking. The third thing, and this is the part that still makes my hands unsteady when I think about it, was what Eleanor asked me to do. She wanted me to genuinely, convincingly, appear to grow tired and unsteady over the course of the next hour, not because anything was actually wrong with me, but because a man who seems tired and a little disoriented is a man whose family stops watching him closely, and a man whose family stops watching him closely is a man who becomes easy to approach with a needle. It was, in its own way, exactly the strategy Marcus had built for his lie, except Eleanor was going to use it as a weapon against him instead. Fake being tired, she told me. Let your guard look like it's down. Let Marcus think the night is going his way. And whatever you do, Walter, do not eat or drink anything else tonight that you didn't open yourself. I did exactly that. For the next 40 minutes I sat in my recliner near the fireplace, let my eyelids droop a little, laughed a beat slower at jokes than I normally would, let my responses to conversation come a half-second behind where they should have. It is a strange, unsettling thing, performing weakness you don't feel, especially in a room full of people who love you and have no idea they're watching a piece of theater. Several guests commented gently that I seemed to be having a long day, that I should probably rest soon. I watched out of the corner of my eye as those comments seemed to please Marcus in a way that made my stomach turn. He kept glancing at me from across the room with an expression I now understand was quiet. Patient calculation, a man watching his window open. Around 9:30, most of the extended family and neighbors had said their goodbyes, leaving only Marcus, Renee, Diane, Sophie, Eleanor, and myself in the house. This, I understood later, had been the plan all along. The crowded early part of the party was cover, a room full of witnesses who would remember only a pleasant evening and a slightly tired birthday boy, and the emptying house afterward was the actual stage. Fewer eyes, more opportunity. A version of events that, if anyone asked later, could be smoothed into. Walter got confused and disoriented that night. We were all there. It happens sometimes as people age. It was Renee who suggested I sit somewhere more comfortable than the recliner, guiding me gently toward the couch in the den, away from the kitchen where Diane was helping Eleanor with dishes. It was such a small, ordinary suggestion, sit somewhere comfortable, but I understood, watching her eyes flick toward the hallway, that she was clearing the stage. "You've had a long night, Dad," Marcus said, appearing in the doorway a moment later, and I noted, with a cold clarity that cut straight through the fatigue I was performing, that he was holding something behind his back. "I brought you something. You know how you always put off your flu shot every year? I picked one up for you. Figured I'd save you a trip to the pharmacy. Early birthday present, sort of." There it was, the lie, delivered with the same warm, reasonable tone he'd used for 6 months to build the record of my supposed decline. A flu shot, so simple, so plausible, so exactly the kind of small, caring gesture that would explain away anything strange that happened to me over the following hour, should anyone ever ask. "That's thoughtful of you, son," I said. "And I want you to understand that every word out of my mouth in that moment cost me something, because the part of me that was still just a father looking at his boy wanted desperately for this to actually be nothing more than a flu shot, wanted desperately for Sophie to have misheard, wanted desperately not to be sitting in my own den, watching my only son approach me with a needle behind his back and a lie on his lips." He came around in front of me and finally revealed what he was holding, a syringe, capped, filled with something clear. My eyes went to it and stayed there. "Where'd you get this?" I asked, keeping my voice mild, curious, the voice of a man who trusts his son completely. "Pharmacies don't usually just hand out loose syringes like that. Renee's got a friend who's a nurse," he said. Too fast, the answer clearly rehearsed. "She set it up for us. Saved us a copay and a waiting room, honestly." He was already uncapping it, already reaching for my sleeve, and I felt Sophie's small hand tighten around mine where she sat pressed against my side on the couch, exactly where her grandmother had asked her to stay. This is the moment. This is the moment. Everything Sophie whispered to me in that hallway 3 hours earlier came due, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because it happened in real time and it happened fast, and both of those things were true at once. Grandpa? Sophie said suddenly, her voice small and clear, cutting through the room exactly the way we had planned it would. Can I sit on your lap for the shot? I don't like needles either. Maybe if I hold your hand, it'll be less scary for both of us. It was such a small, childlike request that Marcus barely broke stride, waving his permission with the syringe still uncapped in his hand. Sure, sweetie, just give your grandpa a second, okay? But that request bought us exactly the 4 seconds we needed. As Sophie shifted toward me, her small body angling between me and her uncle for half a heartbeat, I did something I had practiced in my head a dozen times in the previous hour while pretending to doze in my recliner. I let my arm go slack, the sleeve already pushed up from earlier, and the instant the needle made contact, a contact so brief, so shallow, so deliberately positioned by my own flinch at the exact angle Eleanor and I had discussed, that it delivered nothing but a scratch against skin rather than a full injection. I let my whole body go limp. I want to be precise here, because precision matters in a story like this one. Eleanor's plan had never depended on trusting that Marcus's dose was harmless, because we had no way of knowing what was actually in that syringe, and gambling my life on my son's mercy was never something either of us was willing to do. Instead, in the 90 minutes before that moment, while I performed fatigue in the recliner, Eleanor had quietly, calmly, without a single person in that house noticing, moved through the kitchen and returned with a small folded dish towel, which she'd tucked beside my leg on the couch cushion under the blanket she'd draped over my knees for warmth. At the exact moment Marcus leaned in with the needle, and Sophie's small body created the half-second of chaos and distraction we needed. I turned my arm at the last instant, so the needle caught nothing but the folded fabric hidden beneath the blanket's edge, the plunger discharging harmlessly into cotton instead of my bloodstream, while my whole body performed the collapse Sophie had told me to give him. Play dead. I let my head loll. I let my eyes flutter closed. I let my breathing go shallow and slow, and I heard from somewhere above me my son's voice, and I will never, as long as I live, forget the tone in it, because there was no panic in it at all. There was relief. There we go, Marcus said, quietly, almost tenderly, the way you'd speak to a task finally completed. That wasn't so bad, was it, Dad? Marcus, that was Renee's voice from the doorway, tighter than before. Is it working? How long did the nurse say it takes? 15, 20 minutes for the disorientation to really set in, Marcus said. Long enough that by the time Sorensen gets here with the paperwork, nobody's going to question anything he signs. We just tell everyone he had a long night and wasn't feeling well. I lay perfectly still on that couch, my granddaughter's small hand still gripping mine, playing dead in my own living room while I listened to my son calmly describe the crime he believed he had just committed against me. And I understood, in that moment, exactly how far he was willing to go, and exactly why I had needed Diane's phone recording every word of it from her jacket pocket across the room. What happened in the next 90 seconds is the part of this story people ask me to repeat most often, because it's the part where a plan built out of desperation in a laundry room finally paid off. I stayed limp on that couch for another full minute, giving Marcus and Renee just enough rope to keep talking, keep confirming their own guilt out loud to a room they believed contained only a drugged old man and a 9-year-old too young to understand what she was hearing. Renee moved toward the front window, checking for headlights, murmuring something about Sorensen being 15 minutes out. Marcus knelt beside me, actually checking my pulse at my wrist with something that might have passed, in a different context, for tenderness, and said, low, almost to himself, "Sorry, Dad, I promise this is easier for everyone." That was the sentence that did it, not the syringe, not the folder 6 months earlier. That sentence, spoken so gently, so certain of its own reasonableness, is the one I still hear most clearly when I think back on that night. I opened my eyes. I want you to understand what that moment looked like from Marcus's side, because I've had time since to imagine it from his perspective, and I think it's worth telling. A father he believed was sedated, drifting toward confusion, suddenly staring straight back at him, clear-eyed, steady, and entirely, completely awake. His face did something I don't have a clean word for, somewhere between confusion and the specific horror of a man realizing the ground he's been standing on was never there at all. "Dad, hello, Marcus," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "You want to tell me what was supposed to happen in the next 20 minutes?" He scrambled backward off the couch, so fast he knocked over the side table, the empty syringe clattering to the hardwood floor. Renee spun from the window, and I watched the color drain out of her face in real time as she looked from me, sitting up fully alert, to her husband, frozen and stammering, to the syringe rolling under the coffee table. "You're supposed to," Marcus started, then stopped, his mind visibly racing to catch up with a reality that had just torn itself apart in front of him. "How are you?" Talking, thinking clearly. "Not confused at all," I said. "Funny thing about being warned in advance, son. It tends to keep a man sharp." That's when Eleanor and Diane came in from the kitchen, no longer bothering to hide the fact that they'd been listening from the hallway. The entire time, Diane's phone still held low but steady, its red recording light unmistakable, even in the dim lamplight of the den. Diane didn't say a word at first. She simply held the phone up, angled toward her brother and his wife, and let them see it recording. 23 minutes, Diane said finally, her voice flat and precise in the way I imagine she uses when delivering bad news to families in a hospital corridor. "That's how long I've got of you two discussing exactly what you were about to do to our father." His disorientation, Sorensen's timing, Renee's friend and the syringe, all of it. "Renee," Marcus said, turning to his wife, panic cracking through. "She's bluffing. She can't have." "I'm not bluffing," Diane said. "And even if you doubt me, there's a folded dish towel sitting under that blanket with a puncture mark, and whatever was actually in that syringe soaked into it, which means there's physical evidence a lab can test whenever we decide we want it tested." I watched something collapse behind my son's eyes. In that moment, the particular collapse of a man who has spent 6 months constructing an elaborate lie only to discover, all at once, that every person he needed to fool had known the truth the entire time. Sophie, still pressed against my side, looked up at her uncle with an expression that had nothing childish left in it. "You lied to Grandpa," she said, simply. And there was something in her small, clear voice that landed harder in that room than anything the adults had said. "You told him it was a flu shot." Marcus had nothing to say to that. 41 years old, and standing in his father's den, exposed in front of his wife, his sister, his mother, his father, and his 9-year-old niece, he had absolutely nothing. I'm not going to pretend the rest of that night unfolded calmly, because it didn't, and I won't insult you by acting like justice in real life ever arrives as cleanly as it does in the stories some other channels tell. There was shouting. There was Renee grabbing for Diane's phone before Eleanor physically stepped between them with a steadiness in her voice I'd never heard her use before, telling Renee that if she touched that phone, the conversation we were having would become one the police were having instead. There was Marcus cycling through every version of denial a cornered man reaches for. It wasn't real medicine. It was just to calm you down. "You're twisting this. We were trying to help you." Before finally, when none of it worked, when the room simply stared back at him in silence, he sat down hard in the chair across from me and put his face in his hands. I called Patricia Whitfield, our family attorney, that same night at nearly 10 o'clock. And she picked up on the second ring the way good attorneys who trust their clients always seem to. I laid it out for her plainly. The folder 6 months earlier, the months of quiet narrative building about my memory, the syringe, the recording, the physical evidence sitting in a dish towel on my den floor. There was a long pause on her end of the line before she spoke again. "Walter," she said, "what you're describing isn't just an estate dispute anymore. Depending on what's actually in that syringe, this could be assault, potentially attempted poisoning, on top of elder financial exploitation. I want you to preserve everything exactly as it is tonight. Don't clean anything up. Don't let Marcus or Renee near that towel or that syringe again. And Walter, I need you to call the police tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." I did. 2 officers arrived within the hour, and I will tell you honestly that watching them collect that towel into an evidence bag, watching them speak to my son in the careful, procedural tone officers use when they suspect they're looking at something serious was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Not satisfying, exactly, not yet. Mostly just sad, in a deep and exhausted way I hadn't expected. Even a father who has just watched his son try to drug him doesn't stop, in some small stubborn corner of his heart, wishing none of it were true. The lab results came back 11 days later. Patricia called to walk me through them personally. The syringe hadn't contained a flu vaccine at all. It held a concentrated sedative, the kind typically used in controlled clinical settings, obtained through the nurse friend Renee had mentioned, a woman named Carla Denton who, it turned out, had lost her nursing license 2 years earlier after a separate incident involving improperly administered medication to an elderly patient in her care. That detail alone told Patricia everything she needed to know about how deliberately this had been planned. Marcus and Renee hadn't stumbled into a bad idea in a moment of desperation. They had sought out someone who already had a documented history of exactly this kind of harm and hired her specifically because of it. The attorney my son had scheduled to arrive that night, Grant Sorensen, never made it into my house at all. Diane had texted him posing as Renee, calling off the meeting the moment the recording started, which meant he arrived at an empty curb outside my home at 9:45 and left without ever knowing how close he'd come to walking into a police investigation. Patricia later confirmed what we'd suspected. Sorensen's firm had a documented pattern of drafting guardianship transfer paperwork, specifically designed to exploit the appearance of diminished capacity in elderly clients. The kind of paperwork built to survive a legal challenge, only because it was engineered to look like it followed every rule while gutting the substance of consent entirely. She filed a formal complaint with the State Bar. That investigation, as far as I know, is still ongoing. I want to tell you now about the quiet part of this story, because the loud part, the recording, the police, the lab results, isn't actually the part that changed me the most. The quiet part happened 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, when I finally sat down alone with Eleanor in my workshop, the same workshop where I'd taught Marcus to use a hand plane when he was 7 years old, where a small cedar box he'd built for me in that very workshop still sat on my workbench, exactly where it had sat for 32 years. I picked that box up that afternoon and turned it over in my hands, this small, slightly crooked thing my son had made with his own 7-year-old hands, dovetail joints not quite square, sanded smooth by a boy who'd been proud enough of it to give it to his father, instead of keeping it for himself. I sat there a long time, Eleanor's hand resting quietly on my shoulder, not saying anything, just letting me hold it. I don't know how to carry both things at once, I told her finally. The boy who made this box, and the man who stood in my den with a needle. You don't have to carry them the same way, Eleanor said. You can grieve the boy and still protect yourself from the man. Both of those are allowed to be true. That's the truest thing anyone has said to me in this entire ordeal, and I offer it to anyone listening who's ever had to hold a similar grief. You are allowed to mourn who someone used to be while refusing to accept who they've become. In the weeks that followed, Patricia restructured our entire estate from the ground up. Marcus and Renee were removed, not reduced, not restricted with conditions, removed entirely, from every account, every document, every clause that had ever named them as future beneficiaries. Diane became our sole executor. A separate, fully protected trust was established for Sophie, structured so precisely that neither of her parents, because yes, this detail matters. Renee is Sophie's stepmother, but her biological mother had passed when Sophie was 4, and Marcus retained full custody. Neither Marcus nor Renee could ever access, control, or influence it, held instead under Diane's guardianship until Sophie turns 25. Marcus was charged. I won't walk you through every detail of the legal proceedings that followed, both because they're still partially ongoing as I record this, and because that's not really the heart of this story. What matters is this. The county prosecutor's office took the evidence seriously. The recording and the lab results together built a case strong enough that Marcus's attorney pushed hard for a plea agreement rather than risk trial, and as of the recording of this story, my son is facing supervised probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restriction from any future role in managing my or Eleanor's affairs, medical or financial, for the rest of our lives. Renee is facing similar charges as a co-conspirator. Carla Denton, the woman who supplied the sedative, is facing the most serious charges of all, given her prior history. Sophie still visits us every summer and every winter break, exactly as she always has, though now those visits carry a different weight than they used to. She spends hours in my workshop with me, the same workshop where her uncle once learned to hold a hand plane, and I've started teaching her the same things I taught him: how to measure twice, how to respect the grain of the wood, how patience with your hands teaches patience with everything else in life. Last month, she built her own small box. Dovetails not quite square, sanded smooth by 9-year-old hands, proud enough of the work to want to give it away rather than keep it. She gave it to me. I keep it on the shelf right beside the one her uncle made 32 years ago, side by side, and I won't pretend that doesn't do something complicated to my chest every time I look at it. I asked her once, not long after everything settled, where she'd learned to say those 4 words. Grandpa, play dead, in the exact instant she needed them, with no adult having taught her the phrase beforehand. I saw it in a nature show, she told me matter of fact, the way only a 9-year-old can be matter of fact about something enormous. Possums do it. They can't fight the bigger animal, so they trick it into thinking it already won. I figured you could trick Uncle Marcus the same way, out of the mouths of babes. I have run a company through 2 recessions, built houses for half a county, and negotiated contracts with men who would have skinned me alive for an extra half a percentage point if I'd let them. And the single smartest strategic decision made in this entire story came from a 9-year-old who'd been paying closer attention to a nature documentary than any of the adults around her had been paying to each other. I don't know if Marcus and I will ever repair anything between us. I'm not going to give you the ending where time heals it all, and we sit at the same Thanksgiving table again in a few years like nothing happened, because I don't believe that ending would be honest. And honesty is the only thing I have left to offer you in this story. What my son did wasn't a misunderstanding born out of stress or financial desperation, even though both of those things were real for him. It was a calculated, researched, deliberately sourced act, built over 6 months, executed with a needle in my own living room, on the night of my own birthday, in front of my own granddaughter. Some things don't get to be forgiven just because enough time passes. Some things simply have to be carried and lived around and kept at the distance they've earned. But I'll tell you what I do have. I have a wife who built an entire counterplan in a laundry room in under 10 minutes and executed it flawlessly. I have a daughter who thought to start recording before anyone asked her to. I have 2 small cedar boxes sitting side by side on a workshop shelf, one built by a boy who is gone now in every way that matters, and one built by a girl who saved my life before she'd even finished elementary school. And I have a story worth telling, not because of what my son tried to take from me, but because of what the rest of my family refused to let him have. So if you're listening to this and you've ever had that same cold, quiet feeling that something in your family has shifted in a direction you don't want to look at directly, trust it. Trust the instinct the way Eleanor trusted hers. The way Sophie trusted what she overheard in that parking lot, even though she was terrified to say it out loud. The people who love you, we believe you before you've even finished the sentence. If you liked this story, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you would have done in that den. We read every single one.